Sometimes the greatest bonds are forged between sisters who have nothing left to lose. When everything you've ever known crumbles away, all that remains is the person who shared your first breath and promises to share your last. In the frozen land of Elderglen, twin sisters Isolde and Alinor are summoned to the castle of High Lord Varel, an ancient vampire who has ruled for centuries. Every 100 years, he chooses one maiden as his bride, while the other vanishes forever. But these sisters are not helpless girls. They have survived hardship and loss together. When they arrive at his dark fortress, they expect the worst. Instead, Varel reveals that they carry something precious within their blood, the last trace of his lost humanity. He offers them a choice that will change everything. What happens when two women hold the power to either save a monster's soul or destroy him completely? Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something special waiting for you. The morning mist clung to the thatched roofs of Millhaven like a shroud, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the fading remnants of winter's grip. In the modest cottage at the village's edge, where the herb garden grew wild and the windows glowed with candlelight even in daylight, Isolde pressed her ear to the wooden door and listened to her mother's laboured breathing from the bed beyond. "She's worse today," Alinor whispered, her calloused hands steady as she ground dried chamomile in their mother's worn mortar. The pestle moved in practice circles, the motion as familiar as breathing, after 29 years of watching Elara heal the village's ailments. Isolde nodded, her dark hair falling across her face as she turned from the door. The twins had always been mirrors of each other in some ways, both tall and strong from years of hard work, both bearing the same grey-green eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond their years. But where Isolde carried hope like a candle flame, steady and warm, Alinor had learned to shield her heart with practical wisdom earned through loss. "The fever broke twice in the night," Isolde said, settling beside her sister at the scarred wooden table where their mother had taught them to read the old texts, to understand the properties of healing herbs, and to navigate the delicate balance between the world of men and the older, darker things that dwelt in shadow. Their mother, Elara, had been the village midwife for 40 years, but she was more than that. She was the keeper of old knowledge, the woman who knew which prayers to whisper over a difficult birth and which herbs could ease a soul's passage from this world to the next. The villagers respected her, some feared her, but all came to her when their need was greatest. "She's been asking for the leather pouch again," Alinor said, her voice careful. "The one she keeps hidden beneath the loose floorboard." Isolde's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. They had both noticed their mother's growing urgency about that particular possession, a worn leather satchel filled with herbs unlike any that grew in their garden, remedies that seemed to carry power beyond the natural world. Elara had never spoken of where those particular ingredients came from, but lately she clutched the pouch during her fevered moments as if it anchored her to something vital. "Perhaps it's time we understood," Isolde said finally. "She's been trying to tell us something for weeks now, speaking of old obligations and debts that must be paid." Before Alinor could respond, the cottage door shuddered under 3 heavy knocks that seemed to echo with unnatural resonance. The twins exchanged glances. No one in Millhaven knocked with such authority, especially not in the grey hours before dawn when decent folk were still abed. Isolde rose first, her hand instinctively moving to the iron poker beside the fireplace. Alinor followed, positioning herself where she could see both the door and the narrow window that looked out onto the village path. Together they had faced down drunk men who thought a midwife's daughters were easy prey, desperate mothers who blamed them when their herbs couldn't save a child, and the occasional wild creature that wandered down from the mountain passes. They had learned to stand united against whatever darkness the world might bring to their door. Open, by the decree of High Lord Varel of Elderglen, came a voice from beyond the wooden threshold, cold, formal, and carrying an accent that spoke of distant courts and ancient privileges. The twins felt their blood freeze. Every child in the northern kingdoms knew that name, whispered it in the safe warmth of their beds, while winter winds howled outside. Varel, the Undying. Varel, the Bride-taker. The vampire lord who ruled the cursed lands beyond the mountain passes, where winter never fully retreated and the sun struggled to pierce perpetual twilight. Alinor's jaw tightened. "Pretend we're not here." But Isolde shook her head, her intuition telling her that whatever had brought Varel's emissaries to their door would not be deterred by silence. She lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door open, revealing two figures who stood impossibly still in the morning mist. They wore the deep blue livery of Varel's house, trimmed with silver thread that caught the grey light like captured moonbeams. Their faces were pale, beautiful in the way that marble statues were beautiful, perfect and cold and utterly without warmth. Neither appeared to breathe, though morning vapour rose from their clothes as if they carried winter itself within their bones. Isolde and Alinor, daughters of Elara the Wise. The taller of the two spoke, his voice carrying the weight of formal proclamation. "You are summoned to appear before High Lord Varel, before the final moon of winter. The ancient compact must be fulfilled." The shorter figure stepped forward, extending a rolled parchment, sealed with black wax. The seal bore the mark of Varel's house, a rose encased in ice, beautiful and deadly. "The decree has been signed. You will come willingly, or you will come in chains. The choice is yours, but you will come." Isolde took the parchment with steady hands, though she could feel Alinor's tension radiating beside her like heat from a forge. The paper felt old, ancient even, as if it had been prepared long before their births and waited patiently for this moment. "What compact?" Alinor demanded, her voice sharp with protective anger. "We've made no agreements with your master." The emissary's pale eyes fixed on her with something that might have been amusement. "The compact was made before your grandmother drew breath, child. It binds bloodline to bloodline, generation to generation. Every century, two maidens of age must be brought before the High Lord. He chooses one for his bride, and the other—" The figure paused, tilting his head as if listening to some distant music. "The other serves her purpose in different ways." From the bedroom came a weak cry, and both sisters turned toward the sound. Their mother was awake, and from the tone of her voice she had heard every word. "Go to her," the second emissary said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was softer than her companion's, almost gentle. "She has knowledge you will need for what comes next." Isolde and Alinor rushed to their mother's bedside, finding Elara struggling to sit upright despite her fever. Her grey hair hung in damp strands around her weathered face, but her eyes burned with fierce urgency. "The pouch," she whispered, grasping Isolde's wrist with surprising strength. "Beneath the floorboard. Bring it to me." Alinor knelt and pried up the loose board they had noticed, but never disturbed, revealing a small hollow in the earth below. The leather pouch lay within, wrapped in silk that seemed to shimmer with its own faint light. When Alinor lifted it, she gasped. The bag felt warm, almost alive, pulsing gently like a sleeping heart. Elara took the pouch with reverent hands and opened it carefully. Inside, the sisters glimpsed herbs unlike any they had ever seen, leaves that held silver veins, roots that seemed to glow with inner fire, and flowers that shifted color in the candlelight. "I served in Varel's court once," Elara said, her voice growing stronger, as if the very act of speaking this truth gave her power. "Before I came to Millhaven, before I met your father, I was apprenticed to the court's healer. I learned things there that mortal minds were never meant to know, saw powers that dwelt in the spaces between life and death." She reached into the pouch and withdrew a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to hold captured starlight. "This is moon's blood, distilled from flowers that bloom only in the realm of the undying." And this, she produced a tiny cloth bag that pulsed with warmth. "Seeds from the heart tree that grows at the center of Varel's domain. These are not mere healing herbs, they are fragments of power, pieces of the magical realm that I borrowed when I fled that court 30 years ago. Why did you flee? Isolde asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Because I was pregnant, Ilara said simply, with daughters whose bloodline stretched back to the very beginning of Varel's curse. I knew that one day he would come for you, as was his right by the ancient laws. But I also knew that you would not go to him helpless and ignorant, as so many maidens have before. She pressed the pouch into Isolde's hands. You carry within you the blood of the old nobility, the line that ruled these lands before Varel's transformation. But more than that, you carry the potential to understand his nature, to see past the monster to the man he once was. That understanding may be your salvation or your doom. Alinor's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. What does he do with the brides he chooses? And what happens to the others? Ilara's eyes grew distant, seeing memories that brought both sorrow and fear. The chosen bride is bound to him for a century, sharing in his immortal existence, but losing her humanity piece by piece until nothing remains but hunger and shadow. The other maiden, she paused, struggling with words that seemed almost too heavy to speak. The other is released into the wild lands surrounding his castle, where the endless winter and the creatures that serve it ensure she is never seen again. Then we'll run, Alinor said immediately. We'll take you and flee beyond the northern kingdoms, find sanctuary in lands where his power doesn't reach. But Ilara shook her head weakly. There is no place his reach does not extend, child. And even if there were, the compact binds, not just you, but your bloodline. Run now, and your children, or your children's children, will face this same choice, but with even less preparation. The emissaries had remained silent throughout this exchange, standing motionless in the cottage's main room like beautiful statues. But now the taller one spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The sun grows stronger," he announced. "We must depart within the hour if we are to reach suitable shelter before midday. Gather what possessions you require, but travel light. The journey to Elderglen is long, and the paths treacherous." Isolde looked at her sister, seeing her own mixture of terror and determination reflected in those familiar grey-green eyes. They had always faced the world together through their father's death when they were 12, through the lean years when crops failed, through every challenge their harsh northern life had brought them. This would be no different, except that this time the stakes were not mere survival, but something far more complex. "We go together," Isolde said. And it was not a question. "Together," Alinor agreed, her voice firm despite the fear that lurked beneath. They packed quickly and efficiently, taking their mother's healing supplies, their own few precious possessions, and the warm cloaks that would be essential in the cursed lands of Elderglen. Ilara, despite her weakness, insisted on preparing a final gift, a small charm bag for each daughter, filled with protective herbs and bound with silver thread. "Remember," she whispered, as she pressed the charms into their hands, "you are not helpless maidens being led to slaughter. You are the daughters of two worlds, carrying the wisdom of healers and the blood of nobility. Whatever choice faces you in that distant castle, make it with full knowledge of your own power." As they prepared to leave, Isolde turned back to take one last look at the cottage that had been their entire world. The herb garden her mother had tended with such care, the scarred wooden table where they had learned to read, the narrow beds where they had whispered their dreams and fears to each other in the darkness, all of it would continue existing without them, but it would never again be home. The emissaries led them out into the morning mist, where two horses waited, creatures of impossible beauty, with coats like polished silver and eyes that held too much intelligence. As the twins mounted, they saw neighbors watching from windows and doorways, their faces filled with sympathy and helpless anger. Everyone knew the old stories. Everyone understood that once Varel's emissaries came calling, There was no negotiation, no appeal, no hope of reprieve. But as they rode away from Millhaven toward the mountain passes that led to Elderglen, Isolde found herself thinking not of doom, but of possibility. Her mother had said they carried the blood of the old nobility, that they possessed understanding that might change everything. Perhaps this journey would end not in death or enslavement, but in something none of the old stories had imagined. Beside her, Alinor rode with the grim determination of a warrior heading into battle. She had always been the practical one, the sister who planned for every contingency and prepared for the worst possible outcome. But even she had to admit that their mother's revelations had shifted something in the foundation of their understanding. The path ahead led upward through dense pine forests, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be, and the silence felt heavy with watching eyes. Behind them, the familiar world grew smaller with each step their horses took. Before them lay the unknown realm of an immortal lord, whose nature they barely understood, and whose intentions remained a mystery, wrapped in centuries of fear and legend. But they rode forward together, two sisters who had learned to face whatever darkness the world might offer, carrying with them their mother's wisdom, their own hard-earned strength, and the faint, impossible hope that they might forge a different ending to this ancient tale. The castle rose from the mountainside like a monument to winter itself, its black stone walls seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the perpetual grey sky of Elderglen. No banners flew from its towers, no guards walked its ramparts, yet the sisters felt the weight of countless watching eyes as their horses' hooves rang against the frozen stone of the courtyard. 3 days of travel through increasingly desolate landscape had brought them here, past villages where windows remained shuttered even in daylight, through forests where the trees grew twisted and strange, and finally up the winding mountain path where the air itself seemed to carry whispers of ancient sorrow. The emissaries had spoken little during the journey, but their presence had been oddly comforting. Whatever else they might be, they had kept their word about safe passage. Now, as servants emerged from shadowed doorways to tend their horses, Isolde and Alinor found themselves standing before the massive oak doors that led into the heart of Varel's domain. The wood was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in peripheral vision, roses entwined with thorns, winter landscapes that suggested spring might once have existed here, and faces that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. "He waits within," the female emissary said, her pale features showing what might have been sympathy. "Remember, you are guests here, not prisoners. But also remember that guest right in this realm follows older laws than those you know." The doors swung open without any visible hand touching them, revealing a great hall that took Isolde's breath away. Where she had expected darkness and decay, she found unexpected beauty. Tapestries in rich blues and silvers covered the stone walls, their threads seeming to hold captured starlight. A fire burned in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows that felt warm rather than menacing. And everywhere there were roses, not the frozen perfection of Varel's seal, but living blooms in crystal vases, their petals dark red like wine or blood, their fragrance filling the air with surprising sweetness. At the far end of the hall, seated in a chair that might once have been a throne, but now seemed merely a place of rest, waited High Lord Varel himself. He was not what the sisters had expected. The legends spoke of a creature of terrible beauty, of eyes like winter storms and features carved from marble. But the man who rose to greet them appeared to be perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair touched by premature silver and a face that spoke more of weariness than cruelty. He moved with the fluid grace that marked his inhuman nature, but when he smiled, there was something in the expression that seemed genuinely welcoming. "Isolde and Alinor," he said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries, but also a warmth that surprised them both. "I have waited long for your arrival. Please, sit by the fire. The mountain air can be cruel to those not born to it." They approached cautiously, noting how the servants who moved about the hall setting out food, tending the fire, arranging flowers, seemed neither fully human nor entirely other. There was life in their movements, intelligence in their eyes, but also something that suggested they existed in a space between the mortal world and whatever realm Varel truly inhabited. As they settled into chairs placed near the hearth, Varel gestured toward a table set with simple but elegant fare, bread that smelled of grain and earth, honey that caught the firelight like amber, wine that seemed to hold depths of flavor no mortal vineyard could produce. "You must have questions," he said, taking his own seat across from them. "The journey here allows much time for thought, and I imagine your mother's revelations have given you much to consider." She said, "We carry the blood of the old nobility," Isolde said directly, finding that she preferred honesty to the careful dancing around truth that seemed to characterize most interactions with powerful men. She said, "Our bloodline connects to your curse somehow." Varel's expression grew thoughtful, and he was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory. "Your great-grandmother was Lady Mirana of House Solace, daughter of the last true king, to rule these lands before I became what I am now. She fled when the transformation began, carrying with her the bloodline I thought lost forever." "What transformation?" Alinor asked, her practical mind seeking to understand the foundation upon which their fate was built. Varel rose and moved to the great hearth, staring into the flames as if they held visions of the past. "I was not born a monster," he said quietly. "Once I was merely a lord among other lords, ruling my lands and serving my king with honor. But I fell in love with a woman whose nature I did not understand, a creature of the old magic, beautiful beyond measure and kind beyond mortal comprehension. When enemies threatened her, I sought power to protect her. I made bargains with forces I should have left sleeping in the darkness between worlds." He turned back to face them, and in his eyes the sisters saw not the predatory hunger they had expected, but something that looked remarkably like shame. "The power came with a price, as such power always does. I gained immortality, strength beyond measure, dominion over the creatures of night and shadow, but I lost my humanity piece by piece, and worst of all, I lost her. The very power I gained to protect her made me into something she could no longer bear to look upon." "The curse," Isolde said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The curse of the vampire lords, yes. But more than that, the curse of existing forever with the knowledge of what I had willingly given away." Varel moved to an ornate table near the wall and lifted something from its surface, a goblet carved from what appeared to be black stone, its surface smooth as glass and decorated with silver inlays that formed complex patterns. "This is the blood chalice of binding," he said, holding the cup with careful reverence. "For 100 years it has been used in the ritual that brings maidens to this castle. They drink from it, and the binding is made one becomes my bride, sharing in immortality but losing her humanity. The other—" He paused, setting the chalice down as if it burned his hands. "The other has always been released to the wild lands, where the cold and the creatures ensure she tells no tales." "Always?" Alinor's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Always," Varel confirmed. "Until now." The sisters exchanged glances, feeling the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak. There was something in Varel's manner, something in the way he spoke of the past and looked toward an uncertain future, that suggested this encounter would be unlike all those that had come before. "You said our bloodline was thought lost," Isolde said carefully. "Why does that matter now?" Varel returned to his seat, and when he looked at them, his expression held something the sisters had never expected to see. In the face of an immortal predator, hope, fragile and desperate, and almost painful to witness. "Because you carry within your blood the last remnant of what I was before the curse took hold," he said. "The old magic recognizes kinship, calls to like. In your veins flows the heritage of the kingdom I once served, the humanity I once possessed. You are not simply maidens brought for ritual sacrifice. You are the key to something I thought impossible. Which is, Alinor demanded. The possibility of choice, Varel said simply. Not the choice between death and transformation that I have offered others, but the choice to break the cycle entirely. You could take the curse from me, share it between you so that it loses its power to corrupt. You could end it forever, freeing me to face whatever judgment awaits. Or, he paused, and his voice grew softer. You could help me find a way to transform it into something else, something that serves life rather than feeding on it. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the high windows. The sisters sat absorbing the magnitude of what they had just heard. This was not the brutal choice between submission and death they had expected, but something far more complex and far more frightening, the opportunity to reshape the very nature of an ancient curse. And if we refuse all of these choices, Isolde asked quietly, then I will honor the old compact as it has always been honored, Varel said with evident sadness. The ritual will proceed. One of you will be bound to me for a century, and the other will be released to the mercy of the wild lands. I am bound by laws older than kingdoms, and I cannot simply release you without consequence. What kind of consequence? Alinor pressed. The curse would seek new vessels, Varel explained. Other vampire lords exist, less controlled than I have learned to be. Without the regular completion of the ritual, they would be free to hunt as they chose, to take what they wanted without the restraints that tradition has placed upon them. The loss would be far greater than 2 lives. Isolde found herself studying Varel's face, seeking some sign of deception or manipulation. But what she saw there was only weary honesty, and the kind of profound loneliness that came from centuries of isolation. He was not trying to seduce them into compliance or frighten them into submission. He was simply presenting them with the truth of their situation and trusting them to make their choice with full knowledge. How long do we have to decide? She asked. 3 days, Varel said. The final moon of winter rises then, and the ritual must be completed before dawn. But I will not press you for an answer before that time. Explore the castle. Speak with those who serve here. Learn what you can of the choice before you. Only remember whatever you decide will echo through centuries yet to come. As if summoned by his words, servants appeared to escort the sisters to chambers that had been prepared for them. The rooms were beautiful, warm and comfortable, clearly the quarters of honored guests rather than condemned prisoners. But as they followed their silent guides through corridors lined with ancient tapestries and lit by candles that seemed never to flicker, both sisters understood that comfort did not change the fundamental nature of their situation. They had 3 days to make a choice that would determine not only their own fate, but the future of powers they barely understood. And at the heart of that choice waited a creature who might be monster or man, depending on decisions they had never imagined they would face. The chambers assigned to the sisters were connected by a door that stood perpetually open, as if their hosts understood that separation would be more cruel than any physical hardship. Isolde's room faced east, where the first pale hint of dawn struggled through windows that showed not the cheerful sunrise of home, but the strange, muted light that passed for day in Elderglen. Alinor's faced west, looking out over the castle's inner courtyard, where a garden struggled to maintain life against the endless winter. After the servants had withdrawn, and they were finally alone, the sisters sat together on Isolde's bed and tried to make sense of what they had learned. The luxury of their accommodations, silk curtains, warm furs, a fire that never seemed to die, felt surreal after Varel's revelation that they faced a choice between sharing an ancient curse or watching him honor the deadly compact that had claimed so many before them. He seemed almost relieved to tell us, Isolde said, pulling her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them in the gesture that had comforted her since childhood. As if he's been carrying this burden alone for so long that sharing it felt like mercy. Alinor moved to the window, peering down at the courtyard garden. Relieved, perhaps, but that doesn't make him trustworthy. Monsters have been known to wear kind faces when it suits their purposes. But even as she spoke the words, Alinor found herself remembering the expression in Varel's eyes when he spoke of his lost love, the genuine sadness in his voice when he described the price of his chosen power. If he was performing kindness, it was a masterful deception, or perhaps not a deception at all. A soft knock interrupted their discussion, and when Isolde called permission to enter, the door opened to reveal a woman who was clearly one of the castle's servants, yet unlike the pale emissaries who had brought them here. She appeared to be in her middle years, with auburn hair streaked with silver and eyes that held warmth and intelligence. Her clothing marked her as someone of authority within the household, fine wool in deep green, with silver embroidery that caught the firelight. "I am Thessaly," she said, offering a curtsy that spoke of court training rather than simple servitude. "I manage the household affairs and have served in this castle for 23 years. Lord Varel thought you might have questions that would be better answered by someone who has lived here long enough to understand its nature." 23 years, Alinor repeated carefully. "Then you came here as a maiden summoned for the binding ritual," Thessaly confirmed with calm directness. "I was chosen to remain, while my sister Cordelia was released to the wild lands. I expected to lose my humanity piece by piece, as the legends suggest happens to those bound to vampire lords. Instead, I discovered something the stories never mention." She moved to arrange the flowers that stood in a crystal vase on Isolde's windowsill, her movements careful and deliberate. "Would you like to know what I learned?" "Please," Isolde said, sensing that this woman's experience might provide crucial insight into the choice they faced. "I learned that sharing immortality does not automatically mean losing one's essential self," Thessaly said, settling into the chair by the fireplace with the ease of someone comfortable in her surroundings. "The curse takes only what you allow it to take. It feeds on despair, on the surrender of hope, on the belief that you have become something monstrous. But if you hold fast to who you are, if you remember that power shared is different from power seized, it can be shaped into something else entirely." "But the other maidens," Alinor pressed. "The stories say they became creatures of shadow, losing their humanity entirely." Thessaly's expression grew sad, but remained honest. "Many did, yes, but not because the curse forced that transformation upon them. They despaired because they believed they had no choice but to become monsters. They stopped fighting to remain themselves because they thought the battle was already lost." She gestured toward the mirror that hung opposite the bed, its surface reflecting the room with crystal clarity. "This mirror shows truth to those who gaze into it. Would you like to see what I have become after 23 years of sharing Varel's immortal existence?" Curious despite her caution, Isolde rose and approached the mirror. What she saw there made her gasp, not because Thessaly appeared monstrous, but because she appeared vibrantly, impossibly alive. Her reflection showed not just the woman's physical form, but something deeper, a spirit that blazed with purpose and compassion, untouched by the shadow that the sisters had expected to see in one bound to a vampire's fate. "You're still human," Isolde whispered. "I am human and more than human," Thessaly corrected gently. "I have lived more than twice a natural lifespan, and will live many times more, but I have used those years to learn, to grow, to become more myself rather than less. The castle's library contains knowledge gathered from across centuries. I have studied healing arts that your mother would find miraculous, learned to speak with the creatures of the wild lands, discovered how to coax life from soil that should grow nothing but shadow." Alinor joined Isolde at the mirror, studying her own reflection with new understanding. "And Varel? What has he become in those years?" "Less tormented," Thessaly said simply. "Having someone to share the burden with, someone who chose to see him as more than his curse, it has allowed him to remember parts of himself that he thought lost forever, not redeemed, perhaps, but no longer lost in despair." The woman rose and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where she clearly spent much of her time. But that is only one path among many. Cordelia chose differently. Your sister, Isolde said. You said she was released to the wild lands. She was, Thessaly confirmed, but her tone held no grief. However, released does not mean abandoned. Those stories the villagers tell, about maidens vanishing forever into the snow, they are true, but not complete. Cordelia chose freedom over safety, chose to face the unknown rather than accept any form of binding. She lives still, in the deep forests where the old magic runs strongest. She has become something the legends have no name for, neither fully human nor touched by the vampire's curse, but shaped by her own will into something entirely new. The implications of this revelation settled over the sisters like sunrise after a long night. The choice they faced was not simply between death, transformation, or curse-sharing, but between different forms of becoming. Each path led to change, but change shaped by their own decisions rather than imposed by external force. "Why are you telling us this?" Alinor asked. "If you serve Varel loyally, wouldn't it benefit him more if we remained ignorant of our options?" Thessaly smiled, and in that expression the sisters saw the wisdom that came from decades of choosing hope over despair. "Lord Varel asked me to tell you everything I could about the nature of your choice. He wants your decision to be made with full knowledge, not from fear or false hope. He has learned, over the centuries, that choices made in ignorance create more suffering than choices made in wisdom, even when the wise choice brings pain." She moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something important. "Tomorrow, if you wish, I will show you the library where much of this knowledge is kept. And if you would like, I will arrange for you to speak with others who have made similar choices over the years. You are not the first to face this decision, though you may be the first to face it with the particular power your bloodline carries." After she left, the sisters sat in contemplative silence, absorbing the complexity of what they had learned. The choice before them had grown from a simple matter of survival to something far more nuanced, a decision about what kind of existence they wanted to claim for themselves and what kind of legacy they wanted to leave for others who might face similar crossroads in years to come. "She seemed genuinely happy," Isolde said finally. "She did," Alinor agreed, "but that doesn't mean her choice is the right one for us." They talked long into the night, examining their options from every angle they could imagine, but sleep eventually claimed them both. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new understanding, and perhaps new possibilities they had not yet considered. The library was a cathedral of knowledge, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to dance with their own inner light. Towering shelves stretched from floor to the darkness above, filled with volumes that spoke of centuries of careful collection, leather-bound tomes whose spines bore titles in scripts the sisters couldn't read, scrolls wrapped in silk that seemed to shimmer with preservation spells, and books so ancient their very presence felt sacred. Thessaly guided them through the labyrinthine aisles with the familiarity of long habit, pointing out sections devoted to healing arts, natural philosophy, and the hidden histories of kingdoms that had risen and fallen, while Varel's castle stood unchanging against the mountain stone. But it was toward the far end of the library that she led them, where a massive tapestry covered nearly an entire wall. "The ancestral tapestry," Thessaly said, drawing back the protective covering with reverent care. Woven by the court's chroniclers over the course of 3 centuries, it tells the story of the bloodlines that shaped this realm, both human and otherwise. The tapestry was breathtaking in its complexity, threads of gold and silver interweaving with deep blues and rich crimsons to form patterns that seemed to shift and flow as the sisters watched. At its center stood a great tree whose roots delved deep into the earth and whose branches reached toward the stars. From those roots and branches flowed lines of connection, some bright as sunlight, others dark as shadow, some pulsing with colors that had no names. Here, Thessaly pointed to a cluster of silver threads near the tapestry's lower edge. "House Solace, your grandmother's line. See how the threads connect to the central tree. That represents the bond between the old royal blood and the source of magical power in this realm." Isolde traced the silver lines with her eyes, following their path upward through the intricate pattern. "They connect to this." Thessaly indicated a section near the tapestry's heart, where threads of gold and midnight blue intertwined around what appeared to be a figure frozen in silver thread, the representation of Lord Varel before his transformation, when he was still fully human and served as guardian of the realm's magical balance. Alinor studied the pattern with her practical mind, seeking to understand the relationships it depicted. The dark blue threads that surround him, those represent the curse. The curse, yes, but also the power it brought, Thessaly confirmed. Notice how some of the threads extend outward from this point, connecting to other figures throughout the tapestry. Varel was not the only one affected by his transformation. The magical balance he had helped maintain was disrupted, sending ripples through every bloodline touched by the old power. She moved to a different section of the tapestry, where the threads formed patterns of particular complexity. "Your grandmother fled when the transformation began, carrying with her not just her own bloodline, but knowledge of how the balance might be restored. The chronicles suggest she spent her remaining years searching for a way to heal what had been broken, but died before she could complete her work." "What kind of work?" Isolde asked, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling around her like a cloak. Thessaly led them to a reading alcove, where several books lay open on a carved wooden lectern. The pages showed diagrams that seemed to map relationships between different forms of power, with notes written in multiple hands, spanning what must have been generations of study. She theorized that the curse could be transformed rather than simply broken, Thessaly explained, indicating passages marked with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the library's soft light. Instead of ending Varel's immortal existence or transferring it unchanged to new vessels, she believed it might be possible to reshape it into something that served life rather than feeding on it. Alinor leaned over the pages, her quick mind grasping the implications even before the full theory was explained. She thought the curse could become a force for healing rather than destruction. Precisely. But such a transformation would require willing participation from those carrying the original royal bloodline people who could bridge the gap between Varel's current nature and his lost humanity. Thessaly's voice grew, softer, more personal. "When your mother fled the court, she carried with her not just the knowledge of her pregnancy, but copies of your grandmother's research. I believe she prepared you for this choice, your entire lives, though she may not have spoken of it directly." The sisters exchanged glances, remembering their mother's careful instruction in healing arts that went beyond the merely practical, her insistence that they understand the deeper connections between all living things, her strange certainty that they would one day face choices that would define not just their own lives, but the fate of others. "The herbs in her healing pouch," Isolde said, understanding dawning. She said they were fragments of power from the magical realm. "Seeds from the heart tree," Thessaly confirmed. "Flowers that bloom only where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Ilara gathered them during her time at court, knowing that one day they might be needed to anchor a transformation that would require power from both the mortal and immortal realms." A sound from the library's entrance drew their attention, footsteps approaching through the maze of shelves, accompanied by a presence that seemed to make the very air shimmer with subtle energy. Varel appeared from behind a towering bookcase, his arms carrying a selection of volumes that clearly represented careful consideration. "I thought you might benefit from seeing the historical accounts," he said, setting the books on a nearby table. "Not just the theories about what might be possible, but the records of what has actually been attempted." His manner was different here in the library, more relaxed and scholarly than the formal lord they had first encountered. Surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, he seemed less like an immortal predator and more like what he had perhaps once been, a learned man seeking to understand forces that had shaped his existence in ways he never intended. There have been other attempts to transform curses of this nature, he continued, opening one of the volumes to a page marked with a silk ribbon. Most ended in failure, but a few achieved partial success. The key seems to be willing cooperation between the cursed and those who would share or transform the burden. Alinor approached the table cautiously, still not entirely trusting despite the evidence of Varel's genuine desire to help them make an informed choice. "What kind of cooperation?" "The kind that requires absolute trust," Varel said honestly. "The transformation process would involve sharing not just power, but consciousness, allowing each participant to understand the others completely, without deception or hidden purpose. For someone like me, who has spent centuries learning to guard his thoughts and intentions, such openness would be challenging." "And dangerous?" Isolde asked. "Potentially." Varel closed the book and looked directly at both sisters. If the process began, and any participant held back, tried to maintain control rather than accepting the vulnerability that transformation requires, the result could be catastrophic. We could all be destroyed, or worse, bound together in a curse far more terrible than the one I carry alone. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The choice they faced was not simply about accepting or refusing Varel's offer, but about trusting completely in a process that could either free them all or damn them to something worse than death. "Why are you telling us this?" Alinor asked, her practical mind seeking to understand his motivations. "If the risk is so great, why offer the choice at all?" Varel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ancient tapestry with its intricate web of interconnected destinies. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of isolation and regret. "Because the alternative is to continue as I have for 800 years, watching maidens die or lose themselves to despair, maintaining a balance through regular sacrifice, knowing that each century brings the same choice to new victims." He turned to face them, and in his eyes they saw not the hunger of a predator, but the exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. "If there is even a chance that this cycle can be broken, that future generations might be spared this choice, then the risk is worth taking." The afternoon stretched before them as they continued to study the records and theories, each page revealing new complexities in the choice they faced. By evening, they had gained not certainty, but something perhaps more valuable, understanding of the full scope of their decision and the knowledge that whatever path they chose would be their own, made with wisdom rather than fear. The garden at the heart of Varel's castle defied every natural law the sisters understood. Where they expected barren earth and withered stems, they found a space where life persisted against the endless winter that gripped the rest of Elderglen. Not thriving, perhaps, but enduring, with a stubborn beauty that spoke of deeper magic at work. Isolde knelt beside a bed where roses bloomed in defiance of the season, their petals a deep crimson that seemed to hold warmth despite the frost that touched everything else in the courtyard. She had risen before dawn, drawn by restlessness and the need to think in solitude, only to discover that solitude was a rare commodity in this place, where servants moved like shadows and the very stones seemed to whisper with accumulated memory. "They bloom because they choose to," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find Varel approaching through the morning mist. He moved differently here in the garden, less like the formal lord of the great hall, and more like a man tending something precious. "Each year I expect them to finally surrender to the cold, and each year they prove more stubborn than I am." He knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he touched the soil around the rosebush. "This garden was her work originally, the woman I loved, before the curse changed everything. She believed that anything could grow if it was given enough care and protection, even in the most hostile conditions. "The crimson rose of eternal winter," Isolde said, remembering the artifact Thessaly had mentioned in passing. "This is it, isn't it? The symbol of hope that survived when everything else seemed lost." "One of them," Varel confirmed, indicating a particularly perfect bloom whose petals seemed to glow with inner light. "She planted the original bush the year before I made my bargain with the old powers. It has bloomed every year since, through 8 centuries of winter, as if it refuses to let her memory die with the seasons." Isolde studied his face as he spoke, noting the way his expression softened when he mentioned his lost love, the genuine grief that still touched his features after all these years. What was she like? Wise beyond her years, kind beyond measure, and possessed of a strength that made her unafraid of things that sent brave men fleeing. Varel's smile carried both warmth and sorrow. She saw good in everyone, even in me when I was becoming something that should have terrified her. She stayed with me through the early stages of the transformation, helping me remember who I had been, even as the curse pulled me towards something darker. What happened to her? "She grew old," Varel said simply. "I gained immortality, but she remained mortal by choice. She said she would rather live one human lifetime filled with love than an eternity shadowed by the compromises that immortality requires. I watched her age and fade while I remained unchanged. And when she died—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion that time had not diminished. "When she died, I thought all hope of redemption died with her." Movement at the garden's edge drew their attention, and they looked up to see Alinor approaching with careful steps. She had been exploring the castle's defensive systems with the practical eye of someone who had grown up hearing stories of siege and warfare, but something in her expression suggested she had discovered more than mere military architecture. "We have visitors," she announced, her tone carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of tension. 3 other vampire lords arrived before dawn, requesting audience with Varel. "They're waiting in the Great Hall, and from what I observed, they're not pleased about our presence here." Varel's entire demeanor shifted. The gentle man of the garden replaced instantly by the ancient lord who had ruled these lands for centuries. "Did they give names? Morgrim of the Northern Reaches, Lady Selene of the Shadowlands, and someone they called the Pale Duke." Alinor's military assessment was succinct but thorough. "All arrived with small retinues, all armed, all carrying themselves like people who expect to be obeyed without question." "Old enemies or old friends?" Isolde asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Neither," Varel said, rising and brushing soil from his hands with movements that somehow managed to convey both casual dismissal and coiled readiness for violence. "They are what I have become, vampire lords who rule their domains through the old compact, maintaining the balance through regular sacrifice and the fear it creates. They will view any change to that system as a threat to their own power." He looked toward the castle's main keep, where lights now blazed in windows that had been dark only moments before. "They know about the prophecy, about your bloodline, and they understand what your choice could mean. If you succeed in transforming the curse, rather than simply accepting or breaking it, it could inspire others to seek similar changes. Their entire way of existence depends on the belief that there are no alternatives to the current system." "So they're here to stop us," Alinor said, and it wasn't a question. "They're here to try," Varel corrected. "But this castle has protections that have grown stronger over the centuries, and guest right still holds power even among our kind. They cannot simply attack without provocation." "What kind of protections?" Isolde asked, remembering the way the very air seemed to shimmer with energy in certain parts of the castle. Varel gestured toward the garden around them, where the roses bloomed and morning light filtered through mist that seemed to dance with its own inner radiance. "The same power that allows this garden to flourish allows the castle to defend itself and its occupants. But more importantly, You are not defenseless here. The bloodline you carry gives you access to abilities you have not yet learned to use. As if summoned by his words, Thessaly appeared at the garden's entrance, her expression serious but not panicked. My lord, they grow impatient and begin to make demands rather than requests. They wish to examine the maidens themselves, to verify their bloodline and assess their intentions. Tell them I will join them shortly, Varel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and inform them that the maidens are under my protection as guests of this house. Any discourtesy shown to them will be considered a personal insult. After Thessaly departed, Varel turned back to the sisters with an expression that mixed protective anger with genuine concern. I had hoped we would have more time before others took notice of your presence. The choice you face is difficult enough without external pressure. Perhaps this simplifies things, Alinor said, with characteristic pragmatism. If they're here to prevent us from transforming the curse, that suggests transformation is actually possible. Otherwise, why would they bother to interfere? Isolde nodded, finding strength in her sister's practical wisdom. And if they see us as a threat, perhaps that means we have more power in this situation than we realized. Varel's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration. You begin to understand. Your bloodline does not make you victims to be protected, but participants with the ability to shape outcomes. However, that also means the decisions you make will have consequences that reach far beyond this castle. He moved toward the garden's exit, then paused as if struck by sudden inspiration. There is something you should know before we face them. The transformation process we discussed, it cannot be forced or coerced. It requires willing participation from all involved. Even if they somehow compelled you to attempt it, failure would be guaranteed because the magic responds to genuine choice, not compliance born of fear. You're saying our power lies in the fact that no one can make us choose what we don't truly want, Isolde said, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. They may threaten, they may bargain, they may promise rewards or punishments, but ultimately they need your cooperation more than you need their approval. Varel's smile held both warmth and steel. Remember that as we go to meet them. You are not supplicants begging for mercy, but equals in a negotiation whose outcome will shape the future of our kind. As they walked together toward the great hall, where three ancient powers waited to judge their intentions, Isolde found herself thinking not of the dangers they might face, but of the crimson rose that bloomed in defiance of winter's grip. If love and hope could survive 8 centuries of curse and cold, perhaps they could survive whatever challenges waited in the hours ahead. The great hall had been transformed since the sisters first entered it 3 days before. Where warmth and welcome had once resided, now tension crackled in the air like an approaching storm. The 3 vampire lords who awaited them represented centuries of accumulated power and the absolute certainty that came from ruling through fear and tradition. Morgrim of the northern reaches stood near the great hearth, his massive frame clothed in furs that seemed to carry the chill of Arctic winds. His pale eyes fixed on the sisters with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey, though something in his expression suggested he found them more interesting than he had expected. Lady Selene had claimed the chair that had been Varel's, her elegant form draped in midnight silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her beauty was perfect and terrible, the kind that belonged in marble rather than living flesh, and when she smiled, the expression held no warmth whatsoever. The pale Duke remained standing near the tall windows, his attention seemingly focused on the view of the courtyard garden, but the sisters could feel the weight of his awareness like a physical presence. He was perhaps the most unsettling of the 3, not because of any obvious threat, but because he seemed to exist in a space slightly removed from the normal world, as if he occupied the boundary between life and something else entirely. So, Lady Selene said, her voice carrying the musical quality that made mortal men forget their own names, These are the daughters of prophecy, who would overturn 8 centuries of careful balance. Varel moved to position himself between the sisters and his uninvited guests, a gesture of protection that did not go unnoticed by any of the room's occupants. "They are my guests, Celine, and will be treated with the courtesy that guest right demands." "Courtesy, yes," Morgrim rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "But surely you understand our concern, old friend. The compact that governs our kind exists for good reason. Without it, chaos would consume the mortal realms, and we would face the kind of organized resistance that nearly destroyed us in the early centuries." The pale Duke turned from the window, his movement so fluid it seemed like wind given form. "The question is not whether change is possible, but whether it is wise. These young women carry power they do not understand, power that could unravel more than just your particular curse." Alinor stepped forward, her practical nature asserting itself in the face of beings who clearly expected mortals to cower in their presence. "With respect, Your Grace, we understand our situation quite well. We've spent 3 days studying the history and the options available to us." "Have you?" Lady Celine's laugh was like silver bells ringing in a tomb. "And what understanding have you gleaned from dusty books and ancient tapestries?" "That you're afraid," Isolde said quietly, her healer's instincts reading the tension beneath the vampire's confident facades. "Not of us specifically, but of what we represent. Change. The possibility that the system you've used to maintain power might not be the only option." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed as loud as thunder. Morgrim's eyes narrowed to pale slits, while the pale Duke's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement or might have been the prelude to violence. It was Varel who broke the tension, moving to a side table where an ornate sword lay waiting. The weapon was ancient but perfectly maintained, its blade seeming to drink in the firelight rather than reflect it. "The sword of divided loyalty," he said, lifting the weapon with reverent care. "Forged in the early days of our kind, when the boundaries between human and vampire were less clearly defined. Legend says it can only be wielded by those willing to sacrifice for others, to place duty above personal gain." He offered the sword to Isolde, who found herself accepting its weight without quite understanding why. The moment her fingers closed around the grip, she gasped. The weapon seemed to pulse with life, and suddenly she could feel the intentions of everyone in the room as if they were her own thoughts. Morgrim's determination to maintain the status quo at any cost. Lady Celine's fear that change would diminish her carefully cultivated power. The pale Duke's genuine curiosity about whether transformation was truly possible, Varel's desperate hope that redemption might finally be within reach, and beneath it all, Alinor's fierce protective love and her growing understanding that they stood at a crossroads that would define not just their own fate, but the future of every mortal who might face similar choices in years to come. "Interesting," the pale Duke murmured. "The sword accepts her. That has not happened for 3 centuries. "It means nothing," Lady Celine snapped, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Bloodline might allow her to hold it, but that proves nothing about her wisdom or her right to reshape forces beyond her comprehension." Alinor moved to stand beside her sister, and when she placed her hand on the sword's pommel, the weapon's glow intensified. "Perhaps it proves that wisdom isn't the exclusive property of those who've lived for centuries," she said. "Perhaps fresh eyes can see solutions that experience has made invisible." Morgrim's expression had grown thoughtful. "You speak of solutions, but have you considered the cost? If Varel's curse is transformed rather than maintained, what happens to the balance we've preserved? What happens to the other compacts? The other rituals that keep our kind from descending into the kind of warfare that would destroy mortal and immortal alike?" "That assumes the current balance is worth preserving," Isolde replied, the sword's power allowing her to speak with confidence she hadn't known she possessed. "But how many have died to maintain this balance? How many lives sacrificed to keep your system functioning?" Fewer than would die without it, Lady Selene said coldly. You don't know that, Alinor challenged. You've never tried an alternative. The pale Duke laughed, a sound like wind through empty halls. And you would experiment with forces that could destroy us all, based on theories in ancient books. We would choose our own path, Isolde said simply. The same right. Every being should have the right to determine their own fate rather than accepting what others claim is inevitable. Varel watched the exchange with growing amazement. In 3 days, the sisters had gained not just understanding of their situation, but the confidence to stand as equals before beings who had ruled through fear for centuries. The sword in their hands blazed with light that seemed to strengthen with each word they spoke. You begin to understand, he said quietly. The true power of your bloodline is not magical strength or mystical knowledge. It's the capacity to choose hope over despair, growth over stagnation, possibility over resignation. Lady Selene rose from her chair, her perfect features twisted with frustration. Pretty words, but they change nothing. The ritual must be completed according to tradition, or the consequences will fall on all our heads. Then, perhaps, Alinor said, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through a lifetime of hardship, it's time to face those consequences and discover whether they're as terrible as you believe, or whether they're simply the price of necessary change. The confrontation had reached its turning point. Lines had been drawn, positions established, and the next move would determine whether the ancient compact would continue unchanged, or whether something entirely new would emerge from the ashes of tradition. In the sisters' hands, the sword of divided loyalty continued to blaze with light that spoke of choices made with wisdom and courage rather than fear. The ancient vault beneath Varel's castle had not been opened for over 2 centuries, its entrance hidden behind tapestries and sealed with wards that responded only to bloodline and desperate need. As the sisters descended the narrow stone steps, following Thessaly's flickering torch through passages that seemed to drink in light, they could feel the weight of accumulated power pressing against them like a living thing. The confrontation with the vampire lords had ended in uneasy stalemate, with Morgrim, Selene, and the Pale Duke withdrawing to consider their options while making it clear that they would not simply accept any transformation of the established order. But it was what happened after their departure that had led to this midnight journey into the castle's hidden depths. The sword showed you more than their intentions, Thessaly had explained, as she prepared to reveal the vault's existence. When you touched it together, when your combined will activated its full power, it awakened something that has slept here since before Varel's transformation, something your grandmother hid before she fled, knowing it would be needed when the time for change finally came. Now, as they reached the vault's heavy door carved with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the torchlight, Isolde felt the same pulse of recognition she had experienced when holding the sword. The wood itself seemed alive, responding to their presence with a low hum that resonated through the stone around them. "Place your hands on the door," Thessaly instructed. "Both of you, together. The wards will recognize your bloodline and your unity." When their palms touched the carved wood, the symbols blazed with silver light, and the door swung open to reveal a chamber that took their breath away. The vault was not the dusty storage room they had expected, but a space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. The walls curved impossibly upward, disappearing into star-filled darkness, while the floor beneath their feet was smooth, black stone that reflected their movements like still water. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal of white marble, and upon it rested an object that made the sisters gasp in recognition, despite having never seen its like before. The crown of dominion was not the golden circlet they might have expected, but something far more complex, a band of what appeared to be crystallized moonlight, set with stones that held the deep blue of midnight sky and the silver of captured starlight. "Your grandmother placed it here for safekeeping," Thessaly said, her voice hushed with reverence. She knew that one day, someone of her bloodline would need to make the choice it represents. Alinor approached the pedestal cautiously, her practical mind struggling to accept what her eyes were showing her. What kind of choice? The choice to rule rather than serve. Came a new voice from the vault's entrance, and they turned to see Varel descending the steps. But his expression was not one of surprise or discovery, it was the look of someone whose greatest fears were being confirmed. "You knew," Isolde said, "and it wasn't a question." "I suspected," Varel admitted, his voice heavy with something that might have been grief. "Your grandmother's research was more extensive than I revealed, and her disappearance was more strategic than anyone understood at the time. She didn't flee in panic, she fled with purpose, carrying with her the tools that would one day allow her descendants to claim what was rightfully theirs." He moved to stand beside the pedestal, but did not touch the crown. "The prophecy was never about redeeming me or transforming my curse, it was about replacing me entirely. The crown of dominion grants absolute authority over all vampire kind, the power to reshape the entire supernatural order according to the will of its wearer." The implications crashed over the sisters like a tide. Everything they had believed about their choice, everything they had studied and considered, had been built on incomplete understanding. They were not here to save Varel's soul or share his burden. They were here to inherit supreme power over beings whose individual strength dwarfed anything the mortal world had ever known. "That's why the others are really here," Alinor said, pieces falling into place in her mind. "Not to preserve the old compact, but to prevent us from claiming the authority to destroy it entirely." "And why they cannot simply attack us," Isolde added, her healer's intuition reading between the lines of vampire politics. "If we die before claiming the crown, it passes to the next of the bloodline. But if we claim it willingly, then the power is yours to wield as you choose," Thessaly confirmed. "Your grandmother spent decades researching the crown's history, learning how it could be activated and controlled. All that knowledge is contained in the books she left behind, books that have been waiting in this vault for someone with the wisdom to use them properly." Varel's expression was unreadable as he watched the sisters absorb this revelation. "I understand if this changes everything for you. To accept the crown would mean accepting responsibility for the fate of every vampire lord, every cursed bloodline, every supernatural compact that maintains the balance between our world and the mortal realm. It would make you the most powerful beings in either realm." "And you?" Isolde asked quietly. "What becomes of you if we make this choice?" "I become what I should have been from the beginning," Varel said with surprising peace in his voice. "A servant rather than a ruler, a guardian rather than a lord. The curse that has defined me for 8 centuries would be yours to shape or end as you see fit." Alinor moved closer to the crown, studying its crystalline structure. "This is what you meant when you said the choice required absolute trust. Not trust in a process of shared transformation, but trust in our judgment about how to use ultimate power." "Yes," Varel confirmed. "And it's why I've told you everything, shown you everything, allowed you to question and challenge and discover the truth for yourselves. Because if you do claim the crown, I want that claim to be based on wisdom rather than ambition, on understanding rather than desire for power." Thessaly stepped forward, her expression serious but not fearful. "There is one more thing you should know. The crown can be shared between you, worn by both simultaneously. Your grandmother's research suggested that dual wielding might actually strengthen its power while preventing any single person from being corrupted by absolute authority." The sisters looked at each other, seeing their own mixture of terror and possibility reflected in familiar eyes. The choice they faced had grown beyond anything they could have imagined when they first rode through the castle gates. They were not being asked to save one vampire's soul or accept traditional bindings. They were being offered the power to reshape the supernatural world entirely. "What do you think she would want us to do?" Isolde asked, thinking of their grandmother whose research and sacrifice had made this moment possible. "I think," Alinor said slowly, "she would want us to choose based on what we believe is right, not what we think she intended." From somewhere in the castle above them came the sound of distant bells, not the celebratory chimes of human settlements, but something deeper and more resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself and into their bones. "The final moon of winter rises," Thessaly said quietly. "Whether you choose the crown or not, some decision must be made before dawn. The old compact demands completion of the ritual, and if no choice is made, the other lords will choose for us," Varel finished. "They will invoke the ancient laws and impose their own solution to preserve the system they understand." Isolde reached toward the crown, then stopped with her fingers inches from its crystalline surface. "If we claim this power, we become responsible for every life affected by our decisions. Every vampire who serves or rebels, every mortal who lives or dies because of policies we establish, every future generation that must live with the consequences of what we choose tonight." "Yes," Varel said simply. "Ultimate power means ultimate responsibility. There is no middle ground, no way to accept the authority without accepting all that comes with it." The weight of destiny settled around them like a cloak as they stood before the crown that could make them the most powerful beings in either realm. Above them, the bells continued to toll, marking time that moved inexorably toward a dawn that would find the world either transformed or bound more tightly than ever to the chains of ancient tradition. In the starlit darkness of the vault, two sisters faced the choice that would define not just their own fate, but the future of every being touched by supernatural power. The hours before dawn stretched like a held breath, each moment weighted with the gravity of the choice that could not be delayed much longer. In the chamber above the ancient vault, the sisters sat surrounded by their grandmother's research scrolls that detailed the crown's history, journals that explored the philosophical implications of absolute power, and maps that showed the far-reaching consequences of every decision they might make. Isolde traced her finger along a passage written in their grandmother's careful script, words that seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight. "Power shared willingly multiplies rather than divides. Two hearts united in purpose can bear what would crush a single soul." The wisdom felt both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that they would not face this burden alone, but also that the weight of it would be beyond anything mortal minds were designed to carry. "She knew," Alinor said, looking up from a different text. "From the moment she discovered her pregnancy, she knew we would face this choice. Look." She indicated a series of diagrams that showed the crown's power flowing through paired wielders. She didn't just research how to use it, she researched how to survive, using it without losing ourselves in the process. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside drew their attention, and Varel entered with an expression that mixed urgency with careful control. "The other lords grow restless. They've been conferring throughout the night, and I suspect they plan to force the issue if no decision is made soon." "What kind of force?" Isolde asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They'll invoke the right of succession," Varel explained, settling into a chair across from them. "An ancient law that allows vampire lords to claim dominion over unclaimed bloodlines if those bloodlines fail to assert their own authority. If you don't take the crown willingly, they'll argue that you've forfeited your right to it, and it will pass to whoever among them proves strongest in combat." Alinor's jaw tightened. "And the winner would rule over all vampire kind? Without the wisdom or preparation that your bloodline carries," Varel confirmed. "The crown would amplify their existing nature rather than transforming it. Morgrim would rule through brute force, Selene through manipulation and fear, the Pale Duke through cold calculation that values order over compassion. None of them would consider the welfare of mortals or the possibility of coexistence." From somewhere in the castle came a sound that made them all freeze, a low, resonant horn that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. It was not the gentle bells that had marked the rising moon, but something far more ominous. The horn of challenge, Varel said grimly. "They've begun the rite of succession. We have until the horn sounds 3 times to respond, or they'll consider your claim forfeit." Thessaly appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "My lord, they've taken positions in the great hall. All 3 of them, with their retinues. They're not simply preparing for combat, they're preparing for war." The sisters exchanged glances, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling around them like armor they had never asked to wear. The choice was no longer whether to claim the crown, but how to claim it in a way that would serve justice rather than perpetuate the cycle of domination and fear that had characterized vampire rule for centuries. "There's another option," Isolde said quietly. "An idea taking shape that felt both terrifying and strangely right. One that our grandmother mentioned, but never fully explored." She moved to a chest that contained the most precious of their grandmother's possessions, items that had been hidden in the vault for decades, waiting for this moment. From within, she withdrew something that made Varel gasp in recognition, a set of ethereal chains that seemed to be woven from moonlight and shadow, their links pulsing with gentle radiance. "The binding chains of sacrifice," Varel breathed. "I thought they were legend." "Our grandmother created them," Alinor said, understanding her sister's intention immediately. "They appear when someone chooses to give up power for love, to accept vulnerability in order to protect others. She designed them as an alternative to the crown, a way to claim authority not through domination, but through willing service." Thessaly stepped closer, her eyes wide with wonder. "They would bind you not to the crown's absolute power, but to the welfare of all those affected by your decisions. Every choice you made would be filtered through the needs of others, rather than your own desires." The horn sounded again, its deep note echoing through the castle with increasing urgency. Time was running out, and the vampire lords below would not wait much longer for an answer. "If we choose the chains instead of the crown," Isolde said, working through the implications, "what happens to the power structure? How do we stop them from simply taking what we've refused?" "You don't refuse the power," Varel explained, his voice filled with growing amazement as he understood what they were contemplating. "You transform it. The chains would make you rulers, but rulers bound to serve rather than to dominate. Your authority would be absolute, but it could only be used for the benefit of those you rule." Alinor lifted the chains, feeling their weight not heavy in the physical sense, but dense with responsibility and purpose. "And you? What becomes of your curse if we choose this path?" "My curse becomes my choice," Varel said simply. "I can remain as I am and serve as your advisor, or I can accept mortality and face whatever judgment awaits. But either way, I would be free from the compulsion to maintain the old compact, free to help build something better." The third horn blast split the air like thunder, and with it came the sound of doors opening and footsteps ascending the tower stairs. The vampire lords were coming to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, and the sisters had perhaps minutes to decide how to respond. "Together," Isolde said, extending her hand toward her sister. "Together," Alinor agreed, grasping the chains with both hands as Isolde did the same. The moment their combined will touched the ethereal links, the chains blazed with light that filled the chamber and spilled out through the windows into the pre-dawn darkness. The power that flowed through them was unlike anything they had ever experienced, not the commanding authority of the crown, but something deeper and more complex. They could feel the threads that connected them to every vampire in existence, every mortal whose life was touched by supernatural forces, every future generation that would inherit the consequences of their choices. But with the power came the binding. They could feel the chains wrapping around their souls, not as imprisonment, but as commitment. Every decision they made would be weighed against the welfare of others. Every use of their authority would be filtered through compassion and wisdom. They had claimed ultimate power, but power that could only serve, never corrupt. The chamber door burst open, and Morgrim strode in with Celine and the pale Duke close behind. All three stopped short when they saw the sisters surrounded by radiant light, the chains of sacrifice gleaming around them like captured starlight. "Impossible," Celine whispered. "The binding chains are legend." "Legend made real," the pale Duke said, his voice carrying what might have been admiration. "They have claimed authority through sacrifice rather than conquest. By the old laws, that makes their rule absolute and unquestionable." Morgrim's massive frame seemed to deflate slightly as he processed what he was seeing. "You would bind yourselves to serve those you rule? Accept vulnerability in the name of justice? We would choose strength through service over strength through fear," Alinor replied, her voice carrying the authority of one who had accepted the greatest responsibility possible. "We would build a future where power protects rather than exploits." Varel moved to kneel before the sisters, his gesture one of recognition rather than submission. "What are your first commands, my ladies?" Isolde looked at her sister, seeing her own mixture of determination and compassion reflected in those familiar eyes. "That there be no more commands, but choices freely made. That the old compact be dissolved and replaced with covenants based on mutual benefit rather than fear. And that any who cannot accept this new order be free to seek their own path," Alinor added, "as long as that path does not bring harm to others." The three vampire lords stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In one night, centuries of tradition had been overturned, not through conquest or rebellion, but through the willing acceptance of a burden so great that it transformed power itself into service. Outside the windows, the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of Elderglen's mountains, bringing with it the promise of change that would reshape the supernatural world forever. The transformation began at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight touched the binding chains of sacrifice and set them ablaze with power that seemed to remake reality itself. The sisters stood at the center of a maelstrom of light and energy, feeling the fundamental structure of vampire authority reshaping itself around their willing sacrifice. But not all were prepared to accept this change peacefully. Morgrim's roar of fury shook the castle's ancient stones as he witnessed centuries of carefully maintained order dissolving before his eyes. "This is madness. You would destroy everything our kind has built, everything that has kept the balance between our realm and the mortal world." His massive form began to change, revealing the true nature that lay beneath his civilized facade. His features elongated, becoming more beast than man, while his hands transformed into claws capable of rending stone. The power that radiated from him spoke of arctic wastes and endless hunger, of winters that never ended and prey that never escaped. "If you will not rule through strength," he snarled, his voice distorting as his throat restructured itself for battle, "then you do not deserve to rule at all." He lunged toward Isolde with speed that should have been impossible for something so massive, but the chains around the sisters blazed brighter, and suddenly he found himself stopped mid-stride, held by invisible forces that responded to their combined will. "We do not rule through strength or fear," Isolde said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that came not from dominance, but from absolute certainty of purpose. "We rule through choice, freely given." Lady Celine had been watching the confrontation with calculating eyes, but now she moved with the fluid grace that had made her legendary among their kind. Shadows seemed to bend around her, reality itself growing uncertain in her presence as she wielded powers that played with perception and memory. "Pretty words," she hissed, her perfect features twisting with rage. "But words mean nothing when faced with true power. I have ruled through beauty and terror for 6 centuries. I will not bow to children who think sacrifice makes them strong." The air around her began to shimmer, and suddenly the chamber filled with dozens of her duplicates, each one perfect, each one deadly, each one moving to attack from a different angle. It was an assault that should have overwhelmed any defense through sheer numbers and confusion. But Alinor stepped forward, the chains around her pulsing with gentle radiance, and spoke a single word: truth. The illusions shattered like glass, leaving only the real Selene standing exposed and somehow diminished. The chains had cut through her deceptions with the clarity that came from accepting absolute responsibility. When one's power could only serve others, lies became impossible to sustain. Your beauty was never the source of your power, Alinor said gently, her tone carrying compassion rather than condemnation. Your power came from others' willingness to be deceived by it. But we offer a different choice, the choice to be valued for who you truly are, rather than who you pretend to be. The pale Duke had remained motionless throughout his companion's attacks, his strange eyes studying the sisters with an intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than the physical confrontation before him. When he finally moved, it was not to attack, but to step closer, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "I see," he said quietly. "This moment was always inevitable, wasn't it? From the moment your grandmother first conceived of the chains, the future crystallized around this choice. Not just your choice, but the choice you offer to all of us." His form began to shift, but not with the aggressive transformation that had marked Morgrim's change. Instead, he seemed to become more himself, the boundaries between life and death that had always defined his nature becoming clearer rather than more monstrous. He existed in the space between states, and for the first time in centuries, that existence felt like a gift rather than a curse. "You offer us the choice to become what we were meant to be rather than what we became through fear," he continued, "to find purpose in service rather than dominion." Around them, the castle itself was beginning to respond to the transformation. The stones that had been grey and cold for centuries began to warm, their surfaces taking on a subtle glow that spoke of life returning to spaces long touched only by death. Through the windows, they could see the endless winter of Elderglen beginning to soften, the first hints of spring touching land that had known only snow for 800 years. But the change was not without resistance. From the courtyard below came sounds of conflict as other vampire lords throughout the realm felt the shift in power and began to choose their responses. Some would accept the new order, but others would fight to preserve the only system they had ever known. "The phoenix flame of rebirth," Thessaly whispered from the doorway, pointing to something impossible, actual fire, warm and golden, beginning to dance around the sisters' feet without burning. "Legend says it appears when curses are transformed rather than broken, when death gives way to new life through willing sacrifice." The flames spread outward from where they stood, washing over Morgrim and calming his bestial rage, touching Selene and revealing the frightened woman who had hidden behind masks of perfection, embracing the pale Duke and showing him that his nature as guardian of boundaries was a calling rather than a curse. This was transformation through choice, rather than force the power to offer new possibilities to those who had been trapped by circumstances they thought unchangeable. The phoenix flame reached beyond the castle walls, spreading across Elderglen like dawn breaking after an endless night. With it came a choice that every vampire in the realm could feel resonating in their very bones, the option to remain bound by hunger and shadow, or to transform into something that served life rather than feeding on it. In the great hall below, the retinues of the three lords felt the change washing over them. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by sensations they had not experienced in centuries, warmth without the need to steal it from others, strength that came from purpose rather than predation, the possibility of existing without causing harm. Others resisted, their forms becoming more monstrous as they rejected the transformation and clung to familiar darkness. But even their resistance served a purpose, for it showed clearly the difference between those who chose growth and those who chose stagnation. Morgrim's massive frame shuddered as the flame touched him, his bestial features softening back toward something recognizably human. I remember," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. I remember what it felt like to protect rather than devour, to use strength to shelter the weak rather than exploit them. The memories came flooding back, not the romanticized past that might have been false comfort, but the genuine experiences of purpose and meaning that had existed before fear and hunger became his defining characteristics. He had been a guardian once, a protector of vast northern territories where harsh winters required cooperation to survive. "The choice is yours," Isolde said gently, the chains around her pulsing with light that somehow made her words carry across the entire realm. "You can remain as you are, or you can become what you were meant to be, not as punishment for what you've done, but as recognition of what you could still do." Lady Selene stood frozen, her perfect features streaked with tears that seemed to surprise her more than anyone else. The flame had burned away her illusions, revealing not the monster she feared she had become, but the frightened young woman who had accepted vampirism as escape from a world that valued her only for her appearance. "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted, her voice small and lost. "For 6 centuries, my beauty and my terror have been all I am. Without them, you would discover who you truly are beneath the masks you've worn," Alinor said, extending her hand toward the other woman. "The flame doesn't destroy, it reveals. You have the chance to build an identity based on your choices rather than others' expectations." The pale Duke moved to the great windows, watching as the transformation spread across the landscape below. Where the flame touched, the impossible happened. Snow began to melt, revealing ground that held the promise of green things growing. The eternal winter that had gripped Elderglen for 8 centuries was finally coming to an end. "The heart stone of unity," he said quietly, pointing to something that was forming in the courtyard garden, a crystalline structure that seemed to grow from the earth itself, pulsing with all the colors of the spectrum as it reached toward the lightening sky. "It appears when true understanding is achieved between former enemies." The stone's light spread outward, touching every corner of the castle and beyond, carrying with it a harmonizing influence that helped those struggling with transformation find their balance. It was not forced change, but supported change, the difference between coercion and assistance. Throughout the realm, vampire lords who had ruled through fear felt the choice pressing against their consciousness. Some would accept it immediately, grateful for the chance to escape the cycles of hunger and violence that had defined their existence. Others would need time to understand what was being offered. A few would reject it entirely, choosing exile rather than transformation. But for the first time in centuries, choice itself was possible. Varel approached the sisters, his ancient features showing a peace they had never seen there before. "My ladies, what you have accomplished, it will take generations to fully understand the magnitude of it. You have not simply changed how vampires rule, but whether they need to rule at all." "The old compact is dissolved," Isolde announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the supernatural realm through the power of the chains. "In its place we offer the covenant of unity, protection freely given, service freely chosen, existence that enhances life rather than diminishing it." From the courtyard came sounds not of battle or submission, but of conversation, vampire lords and their retinues talking with each other as equals for the first time in memory, planning how to use their abilities to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. The transformation was not complete. Change of this magnitude would take time to fully manifest, but the foundation had been laid. Where once there had been only the choice between predator and prey, now there existed the possibility of cooperation, growth, and mutual flourishing. As the sun rose fully over Elderglen, bringing true warmth to lands that had known only cold, the sisters felt the weight of their choice settling into something sustainable, not the crushing burden of absolute power, but the manageable responsibility of willing service. They had chosen love over fear, growth over stagnation, unity over domination, And in making that choice, they had offered the same possibility to everyone touched by their realm of influence. The Heartstone's light continued to pulse, a beacon of hope that would guide future generations toward the understanding that strength shared was greater than strength hoarded, and that true power lay not in the ability to command, but in the wisdom to serve. 6 months after the dawn that changed everything, Isolde stood in the garden where Varel's crimson roses had once bloomed alone against the winter's grip. Now the entire courtyard overflowed with life, not just the impossible roses that had survived 8 centuries of cold, but new growth that spoke of genuine healing rather than mere magical preservation. The garden had become a symbol of what was possible when power served life rather than feeding on it. Visitors came from across the known world to see where the transformation had begun, but more importantly, to learn how such change might take root in their own lands. "The delegation from the Eastern Kingdoms arrives tomorrow," Alinor said, joining her sister beside the fountain that bubbled with water that stayed liquid even in winter's depths. She carried a leather satchel that had become as much a part of her as breathing, filled with correspondence from those seeking guidance, reports from vampire lords adapting to their new roles as protectors rather than predators, and proposals for extending the Covenant of Unity to other supernatural communities. "Any word from Morgrim?" Isolde asked, though she could sense through the chains that bound them to their subjects that the former Lord of the Northern Reaches was well. The mystical connection allowed them to feel the general well-being of those under their protection without intruding on private thoughts, guidance available when needed, privacy maintained when desired. "He's established a school," Alinor said with a smile that still held wonder at the magnitude of change they had witnessed, "teaching young vampires how to use their strength for construction rather than destruction. Apparently, beings with supernatural endurance make excellent builders when properly motivated." Through the garden's archways, they could see evidence of similar transformations throughout the castle and beyond. Thessaly supervised a workshop where former servants and former lords worked side by side, creating medicines that combined traditional healing herbs with the enhanced properties available to those touched by immortal blood. The Pale Duke had become their chief diplomatic envoy, his unique nature allowing him to travel safely between realms and negotiate agreements that protected both mortal and supernatural interests. Lady Selene had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. Freed from the need to maintain an impossible standard of perfection, she had discovered a gift for counseling others through difficult changes. Her insight into the masks people wore to protect themselves made her uniquely qualified to help both mortals and immortals find authentic ways of existing in the world. "The strangest part," Isolde mused, touching one of the original roses that had inspired hope through 8 centuries of darkness, "is how natural it all feels now, as if this was always how things were meant to be, and the old way was the aberration." Varel approached through the garden paths, his appearance altered not by magic but by simple peace. He had chosen to remain immortal, but to serve rather than rule, becoming the sisters' advisor and the keeper of historical knowledge that helped them make wise decisions about unprecedented situations. The weight of absolute power had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the lighter but more meaningful burden of willing service. "The reports from the outlying regions continue to be encouraging," he said, settling onto a stone bench that had been carved by vampire craftsmen, learning to create beauty rather than merely claiming it. 3 more Lord Domains have requested transition assistance, and the resistance movements are declining as people see the practical benefits of the new system. In his hands, he carried something that made the sisters' hearts leap with recognition. A small pendant that seemed to hold captured sunlight, its surface warm to the touch, despite the cooling evening air. The eternal spring medallion had appeared spontaneously throughout their realm, worn by those who had chosen transformation over stagnation, growth over fear. "From the children of Millhaven," Varel explained, offering the pendant to Isolde. They wanted you to know that your mother's cottage has become a shrine of sorts, not for worship, but for remembrance. People come there to think about the choices they face, inspired by the example of two sisters who chose love over fear. Isolde accepted the medallion, feeling its warmth spread through her fingers and up her arms. It carried with it the essence of home, not the physical place they had left behind, but the feeling of belonging and purpose that they had found in their new role. She would be proud, Alinor said softly, thinking of their mother and the sacrifices she had made to prepare them for this destiny, and grandmother too. They planted seeds in ground they never expected to see bloom, trusting that someone else would tend the garden they began. As evening settled over Elderglen, now green and growing, touched by natural seasons for the first time in centuries, the sisters walked together through the castle that had become not a fortress of fear, but a center of healing and learning. In the great hall where they had first faced the choice that changed everything, scholars from a dozen nations worked to document the transformation process, ensuring that the knowledge of peaceful change would survive to guide future generations. The binding chains of sacrifice had become invisible to most observers, their presence felt only as a gentle constraint that ensured power could never be used for selfish purposes. The sisters had grown into their authority, learning to balance the needs of individuals against the welfare of communities, to guide without controlling, to protect without smothering. They had not created a perfect world, such a thing was perhaps impossible, but they had created a better one, a realm where choices existed that had not existed before, where strength served compassion rather than replacing it, where the powerful understood their responsibility to the powerless. As they paused at the great windows that looked out over their transformed domain, both sisters felt the same quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done. They had faced an impossible choice and found a path that honored both their own values and the needs of others. They had accepted the burden of power and used it to create more choices rather than fewer. In the distance, the heartstone of unity continued to pulse with gentle light, a beacon that would guide future generations toward understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to command, but in the wisdom to serve. And in the garden below, the roses bloomed on, eternal symbols of hope that had outlasted winter and would outlast whatever challenges the future might bring. The transformation was complete, but the growth it had made possible would continue for generations yet to come.